What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Stihl FS 55RC trimmer, and the problem is it was taken out of long-term storage and now it won't start. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this trimmer. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. For some people, Stihl equipment is the best on the market if you're a homeowner or for commercial use. Whatever your opinion is, they are very well built machines. Now, I have heard of some problems with their equipment, but in general, they are considered very desirable. I'm sure the previous owner of this trimmer bought it because they wanted to make sure it would last for years on their large property. However, even the best equipment can't handle long-term storage when put up improperly. The one thing that must be done before we start working on this trimmer is it needs to be cleaned. I'm not sure why it's dirty, but if I had to guess, the carburetor could have been leaking before it was put up, or fuel was spilled all over it the last time it was filled up. If the trimmer is this dirty, then that dirt could transfer to the carburetor if we end up opening it up. Now, more than likely, the carburetor is the reason why this trimmer won't start, but we're going to make sure before we automatically buy a new one. If it were up to me, I wouldn't bother cleaning it until I fixed it, but I do get a lot of comments from viewers that I should have cleaned up stuff before, during, and even after the fix, so I'm going to take their advice. Now that it's much cleaner, we'll begin by diagnosing what's wrong with it. We need to make sure that the engine isn't worn out as well. The best way to do that is to use a compression tester, but if you don't have one or can't get access to one, the easiest way is to slowly pull on the rope. You'll feel the engine fight back on every compression stroke. If it's worn out, it won't fight back that much. This engine has great compression as it fought hard on each and every stroke, so I'm sure that it's not worn out. Next is to make sure that we have spark. Now, we could use a spark checker, but instead we'll just try and start it after putting some fuel into the carburetor's throat. Now, if it doesn't start, we'll use the spark checker to make sure, but this is a lot easier. And fortunately, it ran very well, so we now need to remove the carburetor from the engine and inspect it. Remove the two nuts holding the air filter base and the carburetor to the engine, and then after that, disconnect the fuel lines and the throttle cable. Once it's off the engine, clean the carburetor the best you can. Then we'll remove the top of the carburetor to inspect the pumping diaphragm and the internal filter. It looks as though the internal screen is not clogged, so the carburetor should be in great shape with no internal issues. However, looks can be deceiving. Also, the check valve flaps on the diaphragm should be flat and parallel with the rest of it. In this case it is, so we'll continue with the inspection. After removing the primer bulb side of the carburetor reveals the metering diaphragm, and unfortunately it's seen better days. You can hear how stiff it is. It's definitely the reason why this engine won't start. Now, don't throw away the whole diaphragm, as we need to get the gasket off of it so we can reuse it when we reinstall the new diaphragm. So here's the new diaphragm. Make sure when you buy yours that the stem in the middle is the same size as the old one. Now, you can buy these online for just a few dollars. We need to check and make sure that the fuel will flow through the filter screen in the carburetor. We'll test that by filling the screen up with fuel and then depressing the rocker arm on the other side of the carb. We want to make sure that the fuel will disappear through the screen. And unfortunately, it didn't flow through the screen, so we need to remove the screen, the rocker arm, and the needle to make sure that they are both clean and clear. Be careful doing this, as there's also an incredibly small spring underneath the rocker arm that you can lose. After removing the screen and the needle, you can use a small wire to make sure that the passage is clear. You can also use some carburetor cleaner to clean the screen, just let it soak in it for a while. After that, put them back into the carburetor for yet another test. It looks like the fuel is flowing like it's supposed to, so we can now put the carburetor back together and then reinstall the carb back onto the engine. This would also be a good time to replace the primer bulb. They can be bought online for just a few dollars. Another reason why your trimmer may not be starting is a collapsed fuel filter line in the tank. This usually happens due to the use of ethanol in gas. The fix is to replace the fuel line and then use only 100% gas in your mix. You can also choose to buy pre-mixed fuel in a can. You just have to choose whether or not you want 40 to 1 or 50 to 1. They're already stabilized and have an extremely long shelf life when compared to gasoline from the pump. Now that the carburetor is back together, let's reinstall it onto the engine. And before we complete the installation, I like to press the primer bulb after the fuel lines are reinstalled, just to make sure it's working like it's supposed to. And unfortunately, it's not priming, so it looks like we have either an internal blockage or a pumping diaphragm problem. Now, at this point, the easiest thing to do is to buy a replacement carburetor. Now, if you want to, you can use an ultrasonic cleaner or even a carburetor dip, but I don't have access to either. What I do have access to is 1-day shipping on a new carburetor, so that's what I'm going to do. It's always suggested to look over both carburetors for any differences before installing the new one. Now, there are some small differences, mainly because it's a generic knockoff, but nothing that'll keep us from installing it and using it. Now, this carburetor was only $10 with extra parts, so it's definitely not an OEM part. If you were to buy the OEM replacement part, it would have been much more expensive. I don't have a problem using a cheap carburetor on my own equipment, but if you're doing this for someone else, make sure you ask them if they mind using a cheap carb over an OEM one. They may be the type of person where quality is very important to them. And as expected, the primer is working like it's supposed to on the new carburetor, so let's try starting it and see how it runs. Well, it starts and runs just fine, but the kill switch isn't working, so I have to choke it to stop it. Nothing wrong with it, but it's still a bit annoying. So my question is, what would you have done with this carburetor when it wasn't priming? Would you have taken it apart again and cleaned it until it worked? Or would you have gotten a new carb kit that would have included a new pumping diaphragm? I know what I would have done, but I'm more curious what your answer is. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.